we'll go from there. All right, so just to reiterate, 15 weeks worth of nutrition workshops will be available basically once I've done this last little series. So this last little series is going to be about rates of weight loss and why you might choose a particular kind of rate of weight loss for a particular time of the year, or based off your goals, or based off lots of other different bits basically. So this week we're going to talk about the pros and cons. Well, overall we're going to talk about the pros and cons of fast and aggressive, slow and not that aggressive, and then kind of moderate weight or fat loss phases. So week one, we're going to talk about the fast and aggressive approach. Now, the fast and aggressive approach has its place, all right? It's definitely not for everybody. So we're going to talk about the pros and cons of why you might take this approach and why you might not take this approach. It's not that this approach is inherently bad. It just comes at a cost, as all decisions do. You know, I think sometimes in general, people only go with the fast and aggressive approach because that's the world we live in now. We live in a world where, you know, I have to get everything I want right now, Amazon Prime, immediate results, blah, 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 blah. And again, that has its place. For Amazon Prime, it absolutely works. And for other stuff, it doesn't work that much. Nutrition often being one of those, training being another one. So without further ado, let's dive straight in. So why might we be trying to lose weight or lose fat in the first place? So let's talk a little bit about the three camps of why people might be trying to look to lose weight or lose fat. Now, the reason I say weight and fat are interchangeable pretty much depends on your goal, right? So if, let's say, for example, for health, you know, you're dramatically overweight, the goal at first is just to reduce weight at any cost, because the goal is health at that point. So if we were to lose a little bit of muscle mass and lose a good amount of just overall body fat, weight in general, that's what we'd be talking about when we're trying to quote unquote lose weight. Most of us, however, are looking to maintain lean muscle mass and lose kind of extraneous body fat, if that's particularly our quote unquote weight loss or fat loss goal. So we're looking to ultimately get lighter on the scale, sure, but we're trying to maintain the good quality lean muscle mass that we've got, and we're trying to lose extraneous body fat. And the reasons we might want to do that, number one, are health, number two is performance, and number three is aesthetic. Now, any of those goals are absolutely fine. Don't let anybody or anything kind of guilt you into feeling that if you want to train to, you know, if you want to change your body composition to look better, that is somehow less valid than your overall health or your overall performance. Sure, it probably doesn't have as big a risks as trying to lose weight based off your health. Like the immediate risks of being overweight and it being degrading to your overall health, like you want to address that first. But if somebody says to you, you know, like, well, it's not about weight loss, you know, it's not about looking better, it's about X, Y, and Z. Well, that's horse shit. That's their opinion. You know, you can do the things that you want to do. So if your overall goal is to look a little bit better and therefore perform better, and, you know, you have better health overall, then that's fine, whatever the driver is for you. So just kind of like to put a disclaimer out there first. So they're typically the three camps that we see people fall into: health, performance, or aesthetic. Right, so depending on your reasons for weight loss or fat loss and the level of specificity of your goal, one of the following approaches might serve you better than the other. So this is where we'll dive into the fast and aggressive, the slow and not that aggressive, slow and kind of safe, and then maybe the moderate approach, okay? So as I said, this week we're talking about the fast and aggressive approach. So below we'll discuss the trade-offs of the three approaches to kind of the thoughts in general, and why we might use them when it comes to our particular goal or our particular kind of desire for weight or fat loss, depending on what it is. So typically the three approaches, as I've said, to reiterate: extremely fast and aggressive, the opposite, extremely slow and steady, and then the moderately somewhere in the middle approach, right? Where, you know, all of these approaches, as I said, have some pros and cons to them. So let's dive into the fast and aggressive. So this week alone, we're just going to talk about the fast and aggressive approach and kind of try and strip back some of the pros and cons. Now, if after this week you decide, you know what, I feel like I could do that, that's great. If you want more guidance on it, please let me know. I wouldn't necessarily say that you have to do the fast and aggressive approach. And if you wanted to hear the pros and cons of the extremely slow and steady or the moderately somewhere in the middle approach, then just wait a couple more weeks and you could try that way as well and just kind of weigh up your options, see which one works best for you. So let's discuss the pros and cons as we go on. So the pros and cons of the extremely fast and aggressive approach. So let's talk a little bit about the pros first. Let's focus on the positive. So if you go faster, you'll get it over with quicker. That's a fact. You know, it's kind of like ripping off the Band-Aid. You have two ways of doing it. You can slowly peel it back and like it's kind of a low grade discomfort and it peels your hair off and it's not that nice. Or you can rip it off and be like, holy shit, that was painful, but I kind of got it over and done with. So it's kind of an obvious one, but the white knuckle approach is viable mainly for that reason, right? The fast and aggressive approach is really mainly viable for that reason because it doesn't require you to do it for a really long time. So too often, however, we see people take the same approach and think that they can stretch it out over months, 12 weeks worth of this fast and aggressive approach. And that comes at some big costs. Psychologically, it's unsustainable, it'll make you miserable, and physiologically, it's bloody exhausting and oftentimes counterintuitive. So we'll talk about both of those things a little bit more. So why might you do the fast and aggressive approach? Well, if you're already pretty close to your goal, and you're quite far along in your training journey, so there are two big variables that I'm talking about here. So if you're down to, you're trying to lose 5 pounds and you've already lost 50 pounds and you're down to that last five pounds worth of body weight, at which point you'll feel like you're at your particular goal, whether it's a body weight, whether it's a body fat percentage, whether it's just how you feel aesthetically, whatever it is. If you're about 5 pounds away from it, or you're pretty close to it, let's not put a number on it because it's going to be different from people to people, from person to person, sorry. If you're quite far along in your training journey, which means you've already got kind of your 4 or 5 days a week training nailed down, you're getting good results out of it, you feel like you can tolerate it, you've got a good program, you're being supported by a good coach, a good support network, like that's what I mean by quite far along in your training journey, then dropping the last couple of pounds might actually be extremely difficult, at which point the fast and aggressive approach can kind of serve a need there. So it's not sustainable for the long term, but in the short term, what you might read or what you might hear as something called a mini cut style of fat loss is actually kind of doable. You can expect a significant jump up afterwards. So it's not sustainable long term necessarily. So if your goal is to lose that last 5 pounds and you're willing to go into a big calorie deficit and take some of the more of the cons with it, know that, once you start adding in more calories, once you start adding back in foods that maybe help you retain a little bit more water, saltier foods or carbohydrates in general, because glycogen binds to water and therefore you will store more water when you eat more carbohydrates in general. Your weight will initially jump straight back up again, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you've added body fat back, but it does mean that your number on the scale might be a little bit different. All right, so that's one thing to bear in mind there. Once you start eating back certain foods, specifically carbs and potentially saltier foods, that you will start seeing a jump back up again. It's not fat gain. In order for you to gain a pound of fat, you need to have overeaten 3,500 calories. Because 3,500 calories is ultimately what a pound of fat actually is. So you need to have been in a surplus of 3,500 calories to quote unquote gain a pound of fat. Most people aren't going to be able to do that. So if you ever, especially not in a day, if you ever see, you weigh yourself every day, for example, and you see a pound jump up or down, don't kid yourself that you've lost a pound in a day, but also don't kid yourself that you've gained a pound in a day from the day before, because in order for that would actually have to be a pound of body fat, something that's going to stick around for the long term, you would have needed to have eaten 3,500 calories extra that day, in addition to all the things that your body burned, right? So if your body burns 2,000 calories a day and you've just eaten 3,500, you actually needed to have eaten 5,500 to have offset that deficit. 5,500 calories is a shit ton of food. You're not going to be able to do that. Like The Rock might be able to eat 5,500 calories worth of food each day. Even then, he'd probably struggle if he was sitting still. So bear that in mind. So if you're super active already, the next kind of pro here is if you're super active already, you don't necessarily need to reduce too much more food, right? So you're not driving that hunger response. But if you can add a little bit more general daily activity, which is, unless you're already up on the go constantly, you're awake for 16 hours a day and you're constantly running around, let's say, for example, you're working a double shift as a construction worker, you probably can't add in any more exercise that way, but most of us can always add in maybe 15, 20, 30 minutes worth of just general physical activity extra each day, especially in the summer where we can go out for a bike ride or a walk after dinner, or previous first thing in the morning, walk the dog for a little bit longer. Then it's easier to potentially create a bigger calorie deficit with what we would call NEAT, which is the acronym for non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is just generally just your day-to-day stuff. You're fidgeting, you're walking around, you're standing up, you're sitting down, you're going to the bathroom, right? You can just increase a little bit more of the calories burned there. And therefore you can create a bigger deficit without having to take on some of that high cost kind of exhaustion and fatigue, right? And which is manageable, and therefore you can get results from it. Again, if you're already kind of maxed out on the amount of exercise that you can do, but you're also already maxed out on the low amount of food that you can eat, then you're kind of at a stalemate. So oftentimes, and I've mentioned this in previous weeks, sometimes, the dichotomy is I'll just say to people, what do you feel like you can do right now? Do you feel like you can eat a little bit less, or do you feel like you can move a little bit more? Because one of those things is going to contribute to the overall calorie deficit equation, and that's one of those things is the thing that has to be done, right? You can do an amalgamation of both, which is maybe a little bit more in the moderate approach, but if you want to create a bigger calorie deficit, you either eat less or move more. That is ultimately the math. That's the nuts and bolts of it, right? All right, so moving on now to the cons, and there are a good amount of cons. Now, if you can get this approach right, then the pros can, the pros that we just talked about actually might be the only thing that works. But for the vast, vast, vast majority of people, and I'm talking like above 95% of people here now, the fast and aggressive approach isn't going to yield as good a results as maybe some of the more moderate or slower approaches, right? And here's why. So to reiterate the flip side of the pro from earlier on, all too often we see people try the extreme approach, a fast and aggressive approach to weight or fat loss, and they think they can sustain it for months on end. But as with anything in life, the faster you go, the more likely you are to veer off the road, right? Think about getting to a destination quicker when you're driving your car. Yeah, you can blast it there, but the faster you go, the more likely you are to you inherently take on more risks with that. More traffic jams, more likely to crash, more likely to lose concentration on the road, more likely to have less reaction time to other stuff. And that is the same thing when it comes to doing pretty much anything that I can think of in life, but specifically this approach to dieting, right? So psychologically, this approach can be both unsustainable and pretty miserable, and it can cause some long-term effects, some kind of long-term negative effects. Some poor relationships with food, the kind of yo-yo dieting approach. Typically, if you're not ready for this approach, this can really spur yo-yo dieting. So if you know that you're already prone to, been in the yo-yo dieting kind of phases before, or you're prone to having a poor relationship with food, this approach is 100% not for you. 100%. I'll say that flat out again with my deadpan face. 100% not for you. Okay? Because the risks are just far outweigh the rewards there. So some of the degrading factors of this approach psychologically are that you'll lose focus, you'll have pretty low energy, you'll show some pretty poor cognition. Last summer, I cut weight for a certification to drop into a lower weight class, and I found it hard to focus on phone calls. I found it hard to focus. If it was to do anything like I'm doing right now, I would be a nightmare. I'm a little bit calorie depleted right now, but I don't feel completely, kind of poor cognition and like I'm losing my train of thought and that kind of stuff. Now, just low energy in general, your body is going to begin to start shutting down right down to its very base systems, which is breathe in, breathe out, don't get run over, go to the bathroom. That's pretty much about it, right? So the lower you get on the calorie or energy totem, the more your body kind of just consolidates its energy to the most essential forms for you. So coming down to like having a conversation with a friend, telling jokes to each other, that shit's not going to happen. You're just going to feel so low energy. You're probably not even going to be able to get the punchline out because your cognition is going to be pretty low. So that's if you're making too big of a calorie deficit. Like overall, your mental faculties are going to be pretty hindered there. There's always a loss of enjoyment in other things that maybe you previously enjoyed as well. You're just not going to feel like you have the energy, and you're going to want to prioritize your energy, the little energy that you do have, to just keeping the lights on. So if you've got kids, going out and playing in the park, you're probably less likely to want to do that. And if you do go and do it, you're probably a little bit more grumpy when you do it. Going out with friends, you're not going to feel like you have a good control over that. You're going to be a little bit less sociable. And that's not you choosing to be sociable. That's simply just, hey, low energy means low output, and low output means I have to be sparing with where I spend my time. So again, for people like bodybuilders, or if you're a fighter trying to make weight for a bout or something like that, then there might be worthwhile sacrifices. But from a long term, not having friends, not being able to engage in societal conversations, not wanting to pick the phone up to your friends and family, not wanting to go out and play at the park with the kids, like, just not fucking worth it. And you can all decide what your own version of that is, right? So you don't have to have kids to recognize what I'm saying here, is basically what I'm saying. So as I said, unless you're making weight for a fight, or you're a bodybuilder in like contest prep, whereby you likely already know that this is part of a short-term process, you just don't need to live this way. All right, it's just not necessary, because the cons far outweigh the pros there. Physiologically, this approach can be pretty exhausting, and when we get down to it, kind of counterintuitive. So if you don't have enough energy to train to create the necessary calorie deficit, so if you just don't take in enough food, if you're creating such a big deficit that you can't actually do anything anymore, then your output will slow, right? And at which point we start a kind of downward circle here. I'm not going to call it a spiral, but we kind of start a downward circle towards, if I do less, I have to eat less to keep up with my calorie deficit. And if I eat less, I can do less. So if I do less, I have to eat less, and eventually you will just run yourself into bare minimum. Okay, there is a point by which you can get the best of both worlds, and it's not a comfortable point, but it is. We think about economics, it's like when we go beyond it, it's diminishing returns, right? So if I keep lowering my calories beyond that point of diminishing returns, I will ultimately have less energy and therefore be able to put less output out, which means I'll have to have less calories, which means less energy, and eventually I'll just hit a stalemate. So from an output standpoint, in terms of making progress, you're going to run out of rope pretty quickly, which is why this is not a long-term approach, right? This is far more of like maximum 4 to 6 weeks if you're really well versed in this approach. So there's no reason to continue to push it beyond that point, because all you're doing is pushing deeper into hunger, deeper into lethargy, deeper into misery, basically. So you don't need to keep going beyond that point. Now, why we were thinking most likely, well, why would people do that? Well, it's purely because we get in the idea of, logically, if I eat less and do more, I'll burn more calories, I'll lose more weight, eat less, burn more, blah, blah, blah. We keep going, but there is that point, as I said, of diminishing returns, where your body is smart. It's going to start reserving its energy. It's going to start, we're talking hundreds of thousands of potentially millions of years of evolution, of animal evolution, including us in that, of animal evolution saying that start reserving energy for the most basic function, which is continuation of the species, which is continuation of just keeping the lights on, right? So, we see it with any animal. If you go and watch a BBC documentary somewhere and there's an animal in the savannah who's, it's dry and it's desert, and they're sitting underneath a tree, skinny and bones and bare, they're not like running around playing with the cubs and whatnot. They're not out enjoying the sun. They are literally waiting for that moment where food might walk by, and then they go into that fight or flight response, and that's when they go hunt. And then they eat if they catch it, and then they sit back down again and have to wait until that number goes back up. You do not want to live that life of being skin and bones and sitting underneath a tree, because it's not really a life. It's basically would be my expectation there. If you're a maniac and you want to do that, go for it. It's not something I would necessarily say, right? It would be a useful use of your time and lifestyle. So continuing along with the physiological portions, this is where we get into maybe how it's counterintuitive, which is dropping calories too low or creating too big of a deficit through exercise risks muscle loss. So this is where, again, we highlight that point of diminishing returns. So to reiterate, we know that muscle is what burns the fuel in the first place, right? So the fuel being the food or the extraneous body fat that we're trying to lose, right? We're trying to get rid of. So purely from an energy standpoint, we want to be able to build and therefore maintain the most efficient and therefore typically biggest muscle mass possible. When I say biggest, I don't mean bulkiest. I don't mean everybody has to be a bodybuilder. I just mean the most efficient engine. there's people out there darkening the doorways of a gym who have been trying to get massive for years, and they still are failing to do so because your genetics will play a big portion in that. So you're never going to get bulky beyond belief, especially not if you're A, female, or B, male and like over 40. If that's the case, then your prime time for building big old bulky muscles is kind of, you're on the other side of that hump a little bit now. I mean that in the nicest possible way, but you're on the other side of that genetic hump a little bit now. And typically women in general have a capacity for building less muscle mass in general. I know that's unfortunate and definitely unfair, but it's just the way it is. Typically a lower genetic propensity for being able to build muscle mass, and therefore bulky muscles are kind of out of the equation. So don't worry yourself with that too much. So building lean muscle mass is what burns body fat. And if we create too big of a calorie deficit, what will start happening is, if I don't have enough carbohydrates or any kind of sustenance in my bloodstream by which to continue to produce an output, produce a force, create activity to build a calorie deficit, my body is going to go and break down the next best thing. So once it's run out of carbohydrates, which is its preferred energy, if that's not free in the blood system, in the blood running through the blood, in the energy system, then it's going to break down the thing that's easiest to break down next. And I'd love to be able to tell you that is body fat, but it's not. It's protein, and therefore the building blocks of lean muscle mass. So if you create too big of a calorie deficit, your body is going to start reaching for muscle next to metabolize and use as muscle mass. And use as energy. So what will start happening is we'll see a diminishing, our muscle mass will start to diminish, and our body fat will stay the same. So yes, we'll probably get lighter on the scale, but from an aesthetic standpoint, we won't look as good. From a performance standpoint, we won't be able to do as much. And from a health standpoint, we've got less lean muscle mass and more extraneous body fat. I think we all know nobody needs to go to the doctor to know that that's probably not the best use of your body weight composition, right? So we want to be able to maintain as much lean muscle mass as possible, which means if we can't afford to create too big of a calorie deficit. Okay, so also knowing specifically that loss of muscle mass inherently leads to, amongst other things, some of these big things, which is poorer athletic performance. What's the point in coming to the gym if you know you're just going to suck at it and everything's going to feel tired and you're going to be sucking wind the whole time? Or going out and riding your bike or playing any kind of sport, if you don't feel good at it, you're far less likely to keep going back. Again, it's kind of counterintuitive because you're not going to want to keep going back to doing things that you're not feeling that great at. Increased risk of injury. If you can't perform that skill very well, or you're feeling a little less cognitive, then the increased risk of injury goes up. And that goes for everything. That means even if you're driving your car, if you're lower cognition because you're in a massive calorie deficit, then that's risky as well, not just squatting in the gym, for example, all right? Lethargy and lack of enjoyment of your life, nobody needs that. We've talked about that, leave it as it is. You'll have a less efficient and therefore slower metabolism. Again, that kind of starts that downward slow spiral, which is if I have less muscle mass, I can burn less body fat, or I can burn less energy, or I can use less energy. And then I keep going round, which means I can't build as much muscle mass, which I just kind of keep going round in this circle. And my metabolism, my ability to be able to burn calories and produce energy, just kind of either hits a stalemate or will keep going down with that cycle. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, just less ideal aesthetics. So you'll get lighter on the scale, but you won't look quite as good. You'll probably look a little bit soft. And if your goal is to get right to that very end where you've got that kind of lean look, then you're not going to get that by creating too big of a calorie deficit. And we've talked in previous weeks, what is the best calorie deficit, or what's the best kind of number to shoot for when it comes to weight loss. And in general, the number that I and most people are typically comfortable with is 1% of body weight per week. So I'm a 200-pound man, which means at most I should be on the upper end. I should be on the upper end of that, so like 1 to 2 pounds. If I was losing 2 pounds a week right now, there's no way I wouldn't be losing body fat. No way I wouldn't be losing body fat, but there's also no way I wouldn't be losing muscle mass either. So that would be probably too aggressive for me. So at the top end, it's a 1% of your body weight per week. Okay, the very top end, and that's if everything is going really well, and that's specifically if everything is looking for a short-term approach to weight loss, okay, or fat loss in general. Anything longer than that, 4 to 6 weeks, you're probably looking far closer to the 0.5% of body weight per week is manageable. But even then, you know, you're not going to be able to completely kind of ignore all the things that we've just talked about. You're still going to have them. They're just going to be less aggressive, which takes us right into our moderate approach, which is what we'll talk about next week. All right. So there's obviously some merit to this approach. And if you're experienced and prepared for what's to come, you know, you'll be fine with it. I would say, however, this is not a beginner's approach. The fast and aggressive approach to weight loss is the thing that most people do every January when they say, that's it, I'm going to do the 30 days, the 4-week such and such, where I'm going to lose 15 pounds. And then 3 weeks from now, they've lost 15 pounds and then gain, and 6 weeks from now, they've gained 12 of it back. So they gain it back at an even faster rate because it's just not viable. You don't learn anything from the process. Your body doesn't actually understand how to be able to keep that weight off. You're not resensitized to going back to, you know, a normal lifestyle. And the last thing to understand there is that if you lose weight at a really fast rate, your body is resensitized to yo-yo right back up, and it will be really sensitive to food in the future. So that when you start, if you just go back to eating quote unquote normally, where you just add in all the joys of life back in, donuts and that kind of shit, and that kind of stuff, sorry, add that back in, then you are far more likely to retain weight that you gain, because you're so sensitive to absorbing those nutrients back in that you'll just absorb them and keep them. And it's not like your energy levels and your muscular system and your psychological aspects of things rebound as quickly as your physiological systems do. So after a week of eating food, after a really aggressive weight loss phase, your body might be ready to go. But from an energy standpoint and a mental standpoint, you're not ready to go, right? So your body has got all this food and it's ready to rock, and it's just going to keep feeling good about adding all this food back in, but you mentally aren't ready to go back into that rock and roll, hey, push back into the gym again. So those systems don't recover at the same speed, and that's oftentimes why we see people go into such a terrible yo-yo cycle. They do 4 weeks of this really aggressive, white knuckle, psychologically taxing thing. It's also physiologically taxing. After 4 weeks, they say, that's it, I've lost my 10 pounds, I'm going to start eating the things I was previously eating again. They add it back in. Physiologically, they recover really quickly. Psychologically, they don't recover really quickly. So maybe they're ready to go within a week, but it takes their brain another 3 weeks of eating food just like that before they can go again, at which point they gained an additional X amount of pounds from where they originally were, which is just not worth your time and effort, right? So most bodybuilders or people trying to make weight who might use this aggressive approach know that there's going to be a resensitization phase right afterwards, and they know that they're not, like, this is not a long-term approach to, you know, manageable weight loss or manageable body composition changes. So bear all those things in mind. There's definitely value to them, but if you're in pretty specific circumstances. So next week we'll talk a little bit more about the moderate and potentially slow and steady approach, and why you might use those more so than another, depending on your goal, depending on your capacity, depending on, you know, your lifestyle in general and what you're trying to get out of it. All right. So as I said, I'm going to do 2 more weeks of this, and we're going to talk about the moderate approach. We're going to talk about the slow and steady approach, and then at that point we'll decide basically if the gyms are open and I'm seeing you all in person. Anyway, maybe I'll put a quick hiatus on this and go from there, and then wait and collect more questions and do all this stuff. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Peace.